hope you don't mind. I'm going to read a little bit from the letter between Benjamin Moser, who is the editor, and Pedro Almodovar, and their correspondence about Clarice, to give the book a little bit of context. And then I'll be reading from the very short introduction and the very short first chapter of the book. So this is called A Breath of Life, Um Sopro de Vida. It's the book that was translated posthumously. And in his letter to Almodovar, Benjamin Moser brings up one of the crucial questions of the novel. And so these are his words. The biggest question that occurs to me as I read A Breath of Life is, was Clarice more or less dying as she wrote it, mad? Because at many points it reminds me of the diaries of Václav Nijinsky, which you surely know, A Journey into Madness. But there is also hidden within this book a terrible story that I discovered when I was researching my biography. It was known that Clarice was born to Jewish parents in the Ukraine in 1920, and that the Lispectors had arrived as refugees in Brazil when she was still an infant. This question about her Brazilian identity sort of haunts Clarice throughout her life because she had such a strange way of writing that people kept questioning whether or not this was an immigrant voice, even though she basically grew up with Portuguese. But this question of difference was something that always surrounded her use of the language. People thought that, much like a Joseph Conrad or someone, that her language didn't sound like the language of a Brazilian, of a real Brazilian. What was not known because of the shame that still predominates in many Jewish families, in that period of war, starvation, and racial persecution, her mother had been raped in a pogrom by Russian soldiers, and that she had consequentially contracted syphilis, which was then incurable. According to the folk superstitions of the remote area where they lived, a woman with syphilis could be cured by pregnancy, and so that is what her parents did. The result of this attempt to save her mother was Clarice Lispector herself. For her mother, however, the pregnancy cured nothing, and Clarice, for the first 9 years of her life, was forced to watch her mother agonizing, paralyzed, exiled, dying. Feeling the guilt of having failed in her attempt to cure her mother, the girl started telling stories in which an angel or a saint or a god came to cure her. All these stories failed. The tragedy is the origin and one of the 20th century's greatest writers, and until the very end of her life, until this book, A Breath of Life, she never lost the hope of repairing the world through mystic means. She was telling these stories until her own death. During her last journey to the hospital where she would die, she said, "Let's pretend that we're not going to the hospital, that I'm not sick, and that we're going to Paris." So her best friend recalled, "We started making plans and talking about everything we would do in Paris. The taxi driver, poor thing, already tired from working all night long, timidly asked, can I go on the trip too?" And Clarice asked, "Of course you can. And you can even bring your girlfriend." He said, "My girlfriend is an old lady, 70 years old, and I don't have any money." Clarice answered, "She's coming too. Let's pretend you won the lottery." When we got to the hospital, Clarice asked how much it was. Only 20 cruzeiros, and she gave the man 200. Needless to say, she never went to Paris. She died 6 weeks later of ovarian cancer. I'd like to read from the very short introduction by Olga Borelli, who was the good friend of Clarice, who lived with Clarice, and was responsible for compiling this book after Clarice's death. Before I do that, I'm going to take a sip of this water. It must have been that strange Brazilian water bottle in the outback there. That's giving me cotton mouth. So she writes, Olga Borelli writes in her introduction, "For Clarice Lispector, my friend, A Breath of Life would be her definitive book. Begun in 1974 and finished in 1977, on the eve of her death, this book, so difficult for her to produce, was, in the words of Clarice, written in agony. For it was born from a painful impulse she was unable to contain. During the same period, she was also writing The Hour of the Star, one of her most famous novels, and her last published novel. For 8 years, I lived with Clarice Lispector, participating in her creative process. I wrote down her thoughts, typed her manuscripts, and most of all shared in her moments of inspiration. As a result, she and her son Paulo entrusted me with the organization of the pages of A Breath of Life, and so it was done. The book actually begins with an epigram, perhaps an epigraph. It's unclear where this line comes from. It simply says on the first page, "I want to write pure movement." A friend of mine asked me if I was going to read it all in Portuguese, and I said no, but I lied. I have to read the first line in Portuguese. It's so amazing. And then I'll continue in English. Given the context, the fact that she was writing this as she was dying and aware that she was dying, that first line has special resonance, I believe. And she writes, "Isso não é lamento, é grito de ave de rapina." This is not a lament, it's the cry of a bird of prey, an iridescent and restless bird, the kiss upon the dead face. I write as if to save somebody's life, probably my own. Life is a kind of madness that death makes. Long live the dead because we live in them. Suddenly things no longer need to make sense. I'm satisfied with being. Are you? Certainly you are. The meaninglessness of things makes me smile complacently. Everything surely must go on being what it is. Today is a day of nothing. Today is down to the wire. Could there be a number that is nothing, that is less than zero, that begins where there is no beginning because it always was, and was before always? I tap into this vital absence, and I'm a young man again, both contained and complete. So it's revealed here that this is a male narrator. But for those of us who know Lispector's work, we feel that there's a kind of gender bending going back and forth between her own voice and this voice that she constructs. Even she seems unsure at times who's speaking in the novel. Round without beginning or end, I am the point before the zero, before the period of the sentence. From zero to infinity, I walk without stopping. But at the same time, everything is so fleeting. I always was, and just as quickly was no longer. The day runs along aimlessly outside, and there are abysses of silence within me. The shadow of my soul is my body. My body is the shadow of my soul. This book is my shadow. Excuse me, may I pass by? I feel guilty when I don't obey you. I am happy at the wrong moment, unhappy when everyone's dancing. I've heard that cripples rejoice just as I've heard that the blind can be glad, because unhappy people make up for it somehow. Life has never been as current as it is today, a hair's breadth from the future. Time for me means the dissolution of matter, the rotting of the organic as if time were a worm robbing the fruit of its pulp. Time does not exist. What we call time is the movement of the evolution of things, but time itself does not exist. Or it exists immutably, and into time we transfer ourselves. Time passes too quickly, and life is so short. And so, to avoid being swallowed by the veracity of the hours and the news that makes time rush by, I cultivate a certain tedium. That's how I savor every loathsome minute. And I cultivate too the empty silence of the eternity of our species. I want to live many minutes within a single minute. I want to multiply myself to take in even the desert regions that give the idea of eternal immobility. In eternity, time does not exist. Night and day are opposites because they are both time, and time cannot be divided. From now on, time will always be the current moment. Today is today. That's actually a very Brazilian thing to do. Brazilians love these tautologies. They'll say things like, today is today. É ou não é? There's a commercial on TV that'll say something like, Tramontina é Tramontina. It's like, Coca-Cola is Coca-Cola. Sometimes you're unsure if this is like her weirdness or if there's a weirdness of just the language that all Brazilians are guilty of. Today is today. And for a translator, I think you can sense already how difficult it is sometimes to negotiate between this this sort of maddening sophistication on her part and then this sort of heartbreaking simplicity that seems almost childlike in her use of language. Today is today. I'm stunned and at the same time suspicious that I've been given so much. And tomorrow I will once again have a today. There is something painful and pungent about living the today, the paroxysm of the highest and sharpest note of an insistent violin. But then there's habit, and habit numbs. The stinger of the bee and the flowering day that is today. Thank God I have enough to eat, our daily bread. I might mention here too that this theme of habit is something that also is something that she's sort of preoccupied with in the book. This idea that one writes in one's own style, and that style becomes a prison. And so she keeps asking the question of how do I unlearn myself, and then how can I write from that kind of, that sort of nakedness of beginning with language, and is that possible? She continues in this vein. I wanted to write a book, but where are the words? All the meanings have been exhausted. Like the deaf and the mute, we communicate with our hands. I wanted permission to write the scraps of words while accompanied by a rustic harp, and to dispense with being discursive, like this. Pollution. Do I write or not? To know when to quit, whether to give up, this is often the question facing the gambler. No one is taught the art of walking away, and the anguish of deciding if I should keep playing is hardly unusual. Will I be able to quit honorably, or am I the type who waits stubbornly for something to happen? Something like, for instance, the end of the world, or whatever it might be, maybe my own sudden death, in which case my decisions to give up would be beside the point. I don't want to race against myself. A fact. What becomes a fact? Should I be interested in the event itself? Have I been reduced to filling these pages with information about facts? Should I make up a story, or do I allow my chaotic inspiration free rein? There's so much false inspiration, and when real inspiration arrives and I don't realize it, would it be too horrible to want to move closer to the lucid self within? Yes, and it's when the self no longer exists, no longer makes demands, that it joins the tree of life, and that's what I struggle to attain. To forget oneself and yet to live so intensely. I'm afraid to write. It's so dangerous. Anyone who's tried knows. The danger of stirring up hidden things. And the world is not on the surface. It's hidden in its roots, submerged in the depths of the sea. In order to write, I must place myself in the void. In this void is where I exist intuitively. But it's a terribly dangerous void. It's where I wring out blood. I'm a writer who fears the snares of words. The words I say hide others. Which? Maybe I'll say them. Writing is a stone cast down a deep well. Take a little break for some water again. Sorry. She makes me a little nervous. I've also lost track of time. The speaker in this first chapter explains that he is going to have to invent a woman. Her name is Angela. And this is the only way he's going to be able to have a conversation about writing, about identity, about perhaps his own madness. So he invents this woman. And the rest of the book after this chapter is the conversation between Clarice's invention of a man who invents a woman named Angela. But if you know Clarice's work, you discover that Angela has written some of the books that Clarice wrote. So there's a funny little game going on here where you're never quite sure what the origin is. You're never quite sure where reality begins, because it seems like we're looking at a mirror in front of another mirror in front of another mirror. So he begins to explain why he needs to invent this woman. And he says, I know that this book isn't easy. For the translator, this is like one of those moments where you just sort of have a wry smile on your face, because you're like, I know, Clarice. It's so hard. The strange thing is when you're done translating it, you actually realize that it wasn't so hard after all. It's almost one of those things where you don't trust the simplicity of it at times. You make it more complicated than it is, because you think to yourself, there must be some other way of writing this. It's almost so easy at times that it tricks you. It tricks the translator. I know that doesn't make sense, but I know that this book isn't easy, but it's easy only for those who believe in the mystery. As I write it, I do not know myself. I forget myself. The I who appears in this book is not I. It is not autobiographical. You all know nothing of me. I never have told you and never shall tell you who I am. I am all of yourselves. I took from this book only what I wanted. I left out my story and Angela's. What matters to me are the snapshots of sensations. Sensations that are thought and not the immobile pose of those waiting for me to say cheese, because I'm no street photographer. I've already read this book through to the end, and I'm adding to this beginning something for you to keep in mind. It's that the end, which shouldn't be read beforehand, comes back to the beginning in a circle, a snake swallowing its own tail. And having read the book, I cut much more than half of it. I only left what provokes and inspires me for life. A star lit at dusk. And this final paragraph or two at the end of this chapter is really where you get a sense of a kind of a sense of her ars poetica, if I can call it that. Do not read what I write as a reader would. Unless this reader works, he too, on the soliloquies of the irrational dark. If this book ever comes out, may the profane recoil from it, since writing is something sacred where no infidel can enter. I am making a really bad book on purpose in order to drive off the profane who want to like. But a small group will see that this liking is superficial and will enter inside what I am truly writing, which is neither bad nor good. Inspiration is like a mysterious scent of amber. I have a small piece of amber with me. The scent makes me sister to the sacred orgies of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Blessed be your loves. Could it be that I am afraid to take the step of dying at this very instant? Careful not to die, yet I am already in the future. This future of mine that shall be for you the past of someone dead. When you have finished this book, cry a hallelujah for me. When you close the last page of this frustrated and dauntless and playful book of life, then forget me. May God bless you then, and this book ends well, that I might at last find respite. May peace be upon us, upon you, and upon me. Am I falling into discourse? May the temple's faithful forgive me. I write, and that way rid myself of me, and then at last I can rest. Thank you.
I'm so, is this working? I'm so glad that all of you came to celebrate these new translations of Clarice Lispector, and I am so glad that Barbara took on these new translations and to celebrate these works in a big, bad way, because she rocks, and I am so excited that she's getting new readers and is going to get the place in the canon of must-read writers that she deserves. Clearly, I have very mild feelings about Clarice Lispector. I'm going to read a section in this book that, it's one of my favorite novels. I translated The Passion according to G.H. And whenever I feel a little too comfortable, I guess, in my life or in my own writing, I go back and read this book because I think it makes me a braver writer. It makes me risk more, not only as a writer, I think, but as a person. I just think it just, you can't read this book and not want to risk a little bit more of something of yourself. So I'm going to read one of the sections that I think is one of those startling, unsettling sections in this novel, and I think it's because when you read Lispector, you're sort of like, oh my goodness, what could you possibly say that would be even riskier or more surprising and unsettling than that paragraph? And then she does. And this is one of those sections. Okay. I'm wondering if there's anything you need to know before I get into this. This book is about a woman who enters her maid's room who has just left and finds a cockroach sort of coming out of the armoire, and she shuts the door and squishes the cockroach in half, and the whole book sort of takes place while she's watching it die, and then does a rather shocking thing at the end. So a lot of the book sort of goes into these metaphysical passages and then goes back to her interaction with the roach. Okay, so I'm going to start with something where she's talking to the roach. Here we go. From time to time, for a light instant, the roach moved its antenna. Its eyes kept looking at me monotonously, the two neutral and fertile ovaries. In them, I was recognizing my two anonymous neutral ovaries. And I didn't want to. Oh, how I didn't want to. I'd taken the phone off the hook. But somebody could maybe ring the bell, and I'd be free. The blouse that I'd bought, they'd say they'd deliver it, and then they'd ring the bell. No, they wouldn't. I'd have to keep recognizing. And I was recognizing in the roach the saltlessness of the time I was pregnant. I recalled myself roaming the streets, knowing I'd have the abortion doctor. I, who about children only knew and only would know that I was going to have an abortion. But at least I was getting to know pregnancy. Along the streets, I was feeling inside me the child that still wasn't moving, while I was stopping to look in the shop windows at the smiling wax mannequins. And when I entered a restaurant and ate, the pores of a child were devouring like the mouth of a waiting fish. When I was walking, I was carrying it. During the interminable hours that I roamed the streets, making up my mind about the abortion, which I had nevertheless already arranged with you, sir, doctor. During those hours, my eyes too must have been saltless. On the street, I too was no more than thousands of cilia of a neutral protozoan beating. I had already known within myself the shiny gaze of a roach captured at the waist. I had walked the streets with my lips parched, and living, doctor, was for me the opposite side of a crime, pregnancy. I had been flung into the happy horror of the neutral life that lives and moves. And while I was looking at the shop windows, doctor, with my lips as parched as someone who doesn't breathe through her nose, while I was looking at the fixed and smiling mannequins, I was full of neutral plankton and was opening my suffocating and quiet mouth. I said this to you, sir. What's bothering me most, doctor, is that I'm having trouble breathing. The plankton was giving me my color. The Tapajos River is green because its plankton is green. When night arrived, I was making up my mind about the abortion I had already made up my mind about, lying on the bed with my thousands of faceted eyes spying on the dark, with lips blackened from breathing, without thinking, making up my mind. On those nights, all of me was slowly blackening from my own plankton, just as the matter of the roach was yellowing, and my gradual blackening was keeping track of the passing time. And was all that love for the child? If so, then love is much more than love. Love is something before love. It's plankton struggling, and the great living neutrality struggling, just like the life in the roach stuck at the waist. The fear I always had of the silence with which life makes itself, fear of the neutral. The neutral was my deepest and most living root. I looked at the roach and knew. Until the moment of seeing the roach, I'd always had some name for what I was living. Otherwise, I wouldn't get away. I don't think anyone has written anything like that ever anywhere in the world. What is that? Amazing. I was like, I just have to stop reading. It's too much pressure. I'll read another short little section from slightly later in the book. More cockroach, more amazing Clarice Lispector. In the Garden of Paradise, who was the monster and who was not? Between the houses and apartments and the elevated spaces between the high buildings and that hanging garage, who is and who is not? How long can I stand not at least knowing what is looking at me? The raw roach is looking at me and its laws see mine. I felt that I was going to know. Don't abandon me now. Don't let me make alone this already made decision. I still had the desire to take refuge in my own fragility, and in the sly yet true argument that my shoulders were woman's, feeble and slender. Whenever I had needed to, I'd excuse myself by arguing that I was a woman. But I was well aware that it's not just women who are afraid to see. Everyone fears seeing what is God. I was afraid of the face of God. I was afraid of my final nudity on the wall. Beauty that knew absence of beauty that had nothing to do with whatever I used to call beauty, horrified me. Give me your hand, because I no longer know what I'm saying. I think I made it all up. None of this existed. But if I made up what happened to me yesterday, who can guarantee that I didn't also invent my entire life prior to yesterday? Give me your hand.
Hi, I have coming off of a cold, so I'll be brief. I'm Barbara from New Directions, and I just wanted to say that I was very lucky to work for a company as a lifer, where we were already publishing Clarice when I joined in 1984, and James Laughlin and Griselda and Peter Laskell and all these people were already behind it, and our publisher, somebody who is really in a kind of a Wunderkabinet of writers, one of the most amazing of all of them. And so it's been wonderful to be part of this revival. Idra and Johnny and Stefan Allison and Ben Moser, who really oversaw this whole project. She is unlike any writer we publish, and I think, as Idra said, she's unlike any writer in the world. There's a sort of fourth dimension, and it's slightly mystical. It's hard to talk about. It's a little bit to me like Kafka. And among all of the things that made me very happy about this new publication is Tom Roberge, our publicity director, got behind it. Michael Barron, Laurie Callahan, who really loved Lispector when she read Ben's new Hour of the Star, which came up before these four that frame the beautiful face, said, now I know why I love her. And that was really satisfying. And so I just want to say that, because I can't really speak, I Xerox for everyone one of my favorite passages from the Chronica, and all four of the books that you read in this series, and particularly two that were tackled by Johnny and Idra, are really very far out. And the Chronica and her stories are a little bit down closer to the ground. And I love this, the princess, which comes in 4 parts, and now you have it. And I just wanted to say 2 of my favorite lines in literature begin with her Chronica. And Chronica is this Brazilian thing where a famous person can write anything they want in the newspaper. And this is one she wrote called In Favor of Fear. And it begins, I am convinced that at some time during the Stone Age, I was definitely ill-treated by some man who loved me. Ever since then, I've been haunted by a secret terror. And then a little one that I just think could help us all go into this evening with Clarice saying, speaking about her, there's a little one that's this long called Yes. I said to a friend, life has always asked too much of me. She replied, but don't forget that you have always also asked too much of life. That's true. Thank you.